Welcome to another edition of One More Light with me, Val Kleinhans. I am with the lovely Antonia Dolhaine today. She is a trauma-informed coach. We're going to chat about just all the things, essentially, post-traumatic growth, support for our loved ones who are watching us go through mental health crisis, all that today. We're going to cover it. Thank you so much for being here, Antonia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I haven't done a podcast in a while, so it's nice to hop on and, record something in this format that is honestly much more comfortable a lot of the time than like trying to type, carousels out on Instagram or record reels.
I never
It's just
know
nice
what
to
to
talk
put.
to a human.
I know. I never know what to put in my Instagram captions. I feel that
Yeah,
struggle completely. I'm like, what do I write? I guess I'll just write a
yeah,
funny one-liner, maybe.
yeah. With,
Well,
with with my captions, it always starts out as like an idea, and then being someone who's quite like rambly in my own head, it just starts to devolve into some sort of like thesis thing, and then I'm just like, no one's reading this at this point, like should I just delete it, or do I leave it? No, I'll just leave it. Yeah.
well, I was reading them and I do read them. And I found you on Instagram. I did see all the talk about post-traumatic growth and I was very curious about it. But let's start
Mhm.
from the beginning, I guess, because that's as good of a place as any. You were not always a coach. You did not always have like an immediate interest in that focus. You were a Cirque du Soleil acrobat at one time. I read that on your website and I was like, what? So what was that like?
What was that like? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I kind of fit that stereotype of someone who ran away to the circus, and something that I say often to the people who come in from the entertainment industry to coach with me as clients. Something that's often missed when we talk about people running away to the circus is like, well, wait a second, what were they running away from? And I definitely had a lot of things that I was running away from. And
Mm.
the circus arts were a way for me to express myself whilst simultaneously kind of being hidden, because I was always playing these characters. But there was a deep desire within me to be seen, as an only child growing up in like, a single mother household with my dad kind of coming in and out whenever he wanted. And my mom working multiple jobs to kind of make ends meet. Like I was just alone a lot,
Yeah.
with my own imagination and my own thoughts. And circus really became a way for me to take my imagination out of my head and onto more of a, platform. Before that, though, I was a competitive gymnast. I never like made it super, super high up, in terms of like the ranks of the gymnastics world, but that was kind of my introduction. My mom, I think her thought was like, well, if I'm going to be at work all the time, rather than just leaving her in daycare, maybe I should leave her somewhere where she'll actually develop a skill of some
Mm.
kind. And what often happens is, a lot of my coaches were from the former USSR and were carrying a lot of trauma themselves, and then kind of like acted out that trauma with us, the kids. So there was like a lot of psychological abuse, a lot of physical abuse that was happening. And so I kind of, yeah, so that's like trying to tell this story in bullet points. That's the background that I came from. And then I went to circus school, and then eventually went on to perform with Cirque du Soleil for many years, and kind of just had this moment, of having worked so hard to get to that point for such a long time, having really like sacrificed my childhood in many ways to achieve this goal of like taking my first bow, in the show in front of an audience of like, 10,000 people. And, for such a long time had been imagining that moment of what that would feel like. But once I actually got there, I was like, oh my God, I feel nothing. Like, oh no, what do I do? This whole moment was supposed to be like, that was it. I finally would be recognized for my work, because most of my extended family thought my circus like hobby was kind of a joke, or my circus dream was kind of a joke. And even though I was doing more impressive things, quote unquote, beforehand, once I got to Cirque du Soleil, suddenly I had like that brand power attached to my name and my being. So it was like I was never more taken seriously than when I was at Cirque du Soleil, by my family, by everyone. And it became this sort of interesting cage for me. Like it liberated me in a lot of ways, in the sense that like I was able to kind of make my own money and stabilize my finances. And I had Cirque du Soleil at the time, at least, I don't know how it is now, had a really good extended insurance plan. So for the first time in my life, regular therapy became accessible to me. And during that
Mhm.
time where I was starting to access therapy, I was just like, oh my God, all the stuff is coming up, you know? Um, and then a number of years later, um, after I'd left Cirque and was on a cruise ship, I got injured and quite badly, and it was due to a case of negligence. So I ended up suing my employer at the time, and yeah, just like couldn't really walk, couldn't really do anything, and just had this moment of like, wow, for the first time in my life since I was like 2, I have free time. I don't need to be at the gym. I'm not, needing to like push my body in these insane ways. And it's just like the weight of everything just came sort of like rushing up. So I was really grateful for all that therapy work that I'd done beforehand in that moment. And there was still a lot to do. And through that work and through deepening my own curiosity and through really experiencing the power that having a, benevolent, loving, unconditionally accepting witness to my pain could help metabolize that pain into gifts that I was able to share in different ways through the world, I made the decision to return to school. I kind of just stopped caring about circus at one point. It was just like this like sharp change in my career in a different
Yeah.
direction. So I returned to school. I'm now a BA psychology student at a university here in Canada called Queen's. And
Oh.
concurrently, I got curious about starting my own practice. Initially, it was breath work, and then I shifted to coaching. Once people were giving me the feedback that like, hey, your breath work sessions are great, but what I'm really enjoying is like the intention setting and the integration pieces that you're doing with me before and after, like that's where I'm really getting the most out of this. I was like, okay, let's do some coaching certifications. Let's like suss this out. And yeah, now here we are, like 3 years later.
Ooh,
um,
yeah,
yeah,
my
that was a
goodness,
whirlwind.
what a life. Wow. So many follow-up questions. I guess I'll start with, at what point did you realize that so much of that was trauma? Was it in the room with the therapist, or were there clues along the way?
Yeah. So um, it was in the room with my third therapist.
Mhm.
Something that a lot of people don't know or realize is that most therapists, when they go through their licensure process, when they go through their, masters of clinical counseling, I think some countries require a PhD in order to practice as a therapist. There is almost zero education in the traditional schooling model around trauma. So a lot of
Mm.
therapists have no idea how to work with trauma. They have no idea how to recognize trauma, which is alarming because trauma is at the root of a lot of mental illness. And a lot of the reasons people are coming into the office is because of that thing. We're becoming more aware of that now as a field, especially since the 1980s, which is when the not post-traumatic growth, PTSD first became a diagnosis in the 80s. So
Right.
it's very,
Yeah.
very recent that we're recognizing this for what it is. So yeah, my first 2 therapists, were just kind of sitting in the room with me, and we were doing the talk therapy thing, but there was a lot that was missing. I
Mm.
developed a lot of self-awareness, but no real tools for managing the chaos in my life. um yeah, and it was only yeah, there's going to be no way to tell this story in short form, so I'll just say through a number of experiences and factors and things that happened along the way, realized that trauma was underneath a lot of that. Also, some repressed memories started coming to the surface at a certain point that I,
Oh.
you know, it's very strange to have that happen where you're like, oh, this has been here all along, but somehow I haven't thought about it until now. So much so that it almost doesn't feel real anymore. And am I just making this up? And so, yeah, it was definitely a whole journey, kind of going through that process and writing those waves. And I feel very lucky now to be meeting my clients, on the other side of a lot of those more dramatic waves, helping them to bridge everything that they've just gone through into the rest of their lives. So out of the therapy container into the rest of their lives, or, sometimes out of one kind of bad therapy container into one that's more appropriate for them. That's something I often do as well.
That's so key, finding the right therapist for you. I've heard that
Mm-hmm.
many times on this podcast with lots of people that I've talked about. How did you know that you found, I think you said it was your third therapist. How did you know that that was the one?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, initially, I think I might have found her on Instagram, and a
Hmm.
lot of her content was really resonating with me. Also, a lot of her life experience was resonating with me.
Okay.
Traditional therapists are encouraged to stay extremely neutral and kind of be like a blank wall. But there were pieces of her story and her own personal disclosure that she was, sharing, that I was like, oh, well, just because someone's gone through the same thing as you doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to know how to treat you. That comes with a lot of, you know, other cons that can come into the room sometimes, but it was enough for me to get curious. And I initially purchased a package of 10 sessions with her, kind of being like, oh, there's just this one thing I want to fix. And like, here we are. Yeah, nearly 3 years later, I'm still working with her. I still work
Okay.
with I have a couple other therapists that I work with for different things, as well as like different coaches for different things. So I'm a big believer in both, and I'm sure we'll get into it at some point, but not as much as understood about what the role of coaching is still. And
Yeah.
they're both like really valuable professions in their own right. There's a lot of overlap, but they are different in a lot of
Yeah.
key ways.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit. What is the difference
Mm-hmm.
between a coach and a therapist?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to speak generally because there's a huge variety of different therapeutic modalities and approaches, and there's also a huge variety of different coaching approaches and modalities. But in general, an analogy I like to use is like if you break your leg, the best person to start with wouldn't be going to a personal trainer to get your strength back. Ideally, you would want to go to a doctor or a specialist who can reset your bone, put a cast on it,
Mhm.
get you resting, make sure you're like nourished. And then at a certain point, once the bone starts to regrow, you send them to a rehab specialist or a personal trainer to help them kind of start to get their strength back. Coaches are really the personal trainers, or the kind of sometimes kind of
Okay.
in the line of the rehab nurse. Doctors and specialists are really the kind of therapists and psychologists. It's an imperfect analogy, but it's, I think, the best way to explain it. Like most of my clients have already spent a number of years in therapy. Most of the symptoms that they came into therapy to begin with have been stabilized to some degree.
Mhm.
They come with a lot of self-awareness, but just not a lot of understanding of how to make that self-awareness tangible in their everyday lives. So that's really where I meet them.
Okay, so it's kind of like we've done grade school with therapy. Now we're at college and we want to learn how to perfect what it is that we've learned, so to speak. We want to specialize, we want to work on it.
Kind of, yeah. Like it's the difference between, you know, if some corporate executive, this is also explaining the difference between kind of trauma recovery and like post-traumatic growth, which is where I work,
Mm,
right?
mhm, mhm.
So if some corporate executive who has like a super stressful job that they hate has like a heart attack, and then has to go to the hospital to get that heart attack treated, and to get them back to health and everything, and then goes back to their regular job, they've been rehabilitated. Post-traumatic growth is when that heart attack happens, and they're rehabilitated, but then we get to a point where it's like, well, how are you going to use this as fuel to transform your life? Because clearly the conditions of your life that you came from are part of what contributed to this heart attack that's happened.
Yeah, and you're going
How
back into
can
it at that point.
You're going back into it? How can we leave you stronger and positively transformed from this experience, rather than just having this be this painful traumatic blip that's happened? um, and yeah, does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I wish I
Mm-hmm.
had you a few summers ago when I went through suicidal ideation in an outpatient program, because
Mm,
the job was what sent me there. And then after, I went back to the job. And then I
mm-hmm.
lasted 3 months before I ended up quitting it altogether. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I wish I could have seen you then, because maybe I could have held out a little bit longer, or maybe the story would have been a little bit different. But you're going into the same environment. It's literally the definition of insanity after all that.
And so little of, I mean, again, this is changing, but so little of our traditional Western therapeutic model, but also medical model, actually looks at the causes of wellness, which is,
Mm.
I think it's called salutogenesis, the way of looking at um, health promoting factors or wellness promoting factors, and increasing those factors rather than just studying illness and
Mhm.
things that break us, which is what our current Western therapeutic, like traditional therapeutic model, that's where we're coming from. That's the paradigm we're coming from, as well as the medical world, kind of just looking at, all right, let's look at everything that makes this dysfunctional, rather than how can we crowd out that dysfunction with a lot of functional activity to bring the whole system back into balance, back into homeostasis.
Yeah. It's what do we do now that we're in that environment? And it's like, okay, now how are we going to actually apply it? That's
Mm-hmm.
post-traumatic growth.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Yeah. So post-traumatic growth is based on would we call it a theory? Basically, there was this scale, or this list of measures, that was created by two psychologists in the mid 1990s called Tedeschi and Calhoun. And they came up with this by interviewing hundreds of trauma survivors, trying to determine which factors really contributed to them coming out, coming out recovered or better.
Mhm.
So it's a 21 marker scale based on a 5-factor model. And
Mhm.
those 5 factors, so the 5 factors being like different groups that these questions that people are rating themselves on fall into. And those 5 factors are relating to others, new possibilities, personal strength, spiritual change, and note that's not specifically religious.
Yeah.
We can understand spirituality as just having a sense of connection to a larger whole.
However you define it. Yeah.
However you define it, exactly, and appreciation of life. And I actually have the post-traumatic growth inventory up here. And, some of the questions you might find on this scale are, rate from 1 to 5 the degree to which I change my priorities about what is important in life, or I have a greater appreciation for the value of my own life. I develop new interests. I have a greater feeling of self-reliance. So these are kind of the things that we're looking at, trying to amplify and strengthen in a container that is promoting post-traumatic growth.
Okay. I'm sure self-esteem is something that you absolutely work on when because it can be shot after you've been
Mm-hmm.
through something traumatic. I mean, I know I just had this thought, like, it could be hard to love ourselves after we've been through something traumatic. And sometimes when I try to comfort myself or speak kindly to myself, when I hit dark spaces, I just end up thinking some of those nice words are a lie. Or,
Mm-hmm.
maybe because the past told me otherwise, or
Yeah.
because I don't see or believe that there's going to be any improvement in whatever situation it is that I'm in. So, is there a way to level with ourselves and treat ourselves better, but do it with honesty so that we can find that confidence again?
Mm, that's a both a simple one, but also a deeply complex one to navigate post
Hmm.
trauma, is particularly if the trauma has been relational, if we've been abused over and over again, or even just once
Mm.
in a really significant way, because a huge way that we learn after we've been traumatized to cope with the enormity of that trauma is to blame ourselves, with
Yeah.
the kind of belief underneath being, if I was just more X, Y, or Z, smarter, better, more beautiful, more perfect, whatever, then this wouldn't have happened to me. And it's a way of just
Oh
trying to
God, I've
like
been there.
anchor ourselves in, like, this is such an enormously, incomprehensibly painful event that if, the shame is almost, while it injures us even more, it's almost a way of trying to protect ourselves. It's like a protective scab over top of a wound. And what a lot of kind of conventional therapy tries to do is it like picks at the wound, or sorry, picks at the scab and goes, get rid of this, no more shame, instead of, like surrounding the wound in, cotton and,
Mhm.
ointment and softness and safety, and basically creating the conditions for the scab to just fall off on its own. Like when we have the safe conditions for a wound to heal, these protective layers, the anger, the shame, the guilt, the denial, the delusion, whatever it is, they peel away on their own. It's not that
Mhm.
they're going away, they're just being reintegrated into the whole. It's kind of like, when we're wounded, in order to protect our core self, we stratify into these different layers, just, which is
Mhm.
really incredible. Um, so to your question about how can we be honest about it, that is a process. It takes a lot of safety for someone to get to a place where they're able to actually be honest with themselves about what's happened to them, where they're able to step into the kind of identity of a victim, which is interesting, right? Because a lot of the discourse in the personal development world is like, it treats victims with this sort of disdain or resentment, like, oh, don't be such a victim, where in
I've read that in
reality,
the comments before.
yeah, where in reality, what happens most of the time when someone gets traumatized is that, the first symptom of trauma is denial. We don't want to
Mm,
acknowledge what's happened to us. So it's sometimes the first phase of our recovery is just getting to a place where we feel safe enough to go, okay, maybe something did happen. And okay, maybe something really did hurt me. And through that process, we can start kind of peeling back those layers, the denial, the shame, the anger, and start to get to a place where we can really grieve. And from there, bloom forward and build forward.
okay, so we can establish this happened to me, and it's almost like
Mhm.
improv in a little bit of a way. It's like,
Mhm.
well, this happened, but there could be a positive note to end that. We just have to
Yeah,
be in a safe place to get there.
definitely. That's the missing piece of this, thing that flies around all the time of like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, which is such an incomplete and like dangerous thought, really,
Mm,
because we have these survivors who go through these horrible, horrible traumas. And then we just have these people coming at them and being like, well, if you're not stronger from this, then this means that you're broken. Where like, if we were to elaborate and complete this thought, it should really be something I like wrote something down in my notes just to build this out, but it should really be more like what doesn't kill us significantly fucks us up, but can also, under safe healing conditions and with the right support, serve as a catalyst for deeper positive transformation if we do the work to use that event as fertilizer for our growth. So it's not as
mm.
snappy, but it's a lot more accurate.
Yeah, it's more direct. Like and
Mm-hmm.
essentially it's saying you have to put in the work. You're not like I'm the kind of person where I'm terrified of grocery stores because I hate when people like Inspector Gadget their arm around me because Gertrude
Mm-hmm.
needs her milk and she needs it like fast. And I'm like, you're
Mm-hmm.
in my bubble. You're in my personal space. Don't like
Mm-hmm.
that at all. I don't know why, but it's just a thing I have. So if I can maybe get to a place like where I go to the grocery store and I'm like, all right, I didn't have a bad experience this time. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe this is safe. We can kind of sort of build from there, even though we
Mm-hmm.
are going to run across those Gertrudes here and there. But
Absolutely, absolutely. It's not, I think sometimes we think recovery is removing all of the threats. And sometimes that is necessary at the beginning. We need to, kind of put people in a safe room, in a bit of a rehabilitative nursery, so to speak, to get to a place where they're strong enough to leave and reintegrate into the rest of the world. A crucial thing that differentiates trauma-informed coaching and trauma therapy from other forms of coaching and therapy is that, it doesn't just place all this onus on the individual. Like,
mm,
if we acknowledge that, what doesn't kill us doesn't necessarily make us stronger, if these other factors aren't present, then suddenly we're going, okay, it's not just up to the individual to do this work. It's also up to us as a society to create safe conditions for survivors to thrive.
yeah,
And
that's
that's
the
the
biggest
piece that a
challenge of
lot of people
all.
don't want to look at,
I
you know?
know. That's the biggest challenge of all. I was going to ask because I know you also do spend time with breath work. Is breath work something we can do to maybe give ourselves that hug or so that we feel safer? Because I feel better after taking a few breaths. I'm sure most people do.
Mm-hmm. There are certain breath techniques that I show to clients to help them regulate their nervous systems. Nervous system regulation and emotional regulation are really the foundation of creating internal safety, which is a lot of what we do specifically at the beginning of
Okay.
coaching with me. Is we'll do a thorough like taking stock of what kind of internal resources they already have to help themselves feel safe and connected and anchored in their inner world. And for some people, there's a lot of them. For some people, there's almost none of them. And then we'll also zoom out and kind of be like, okay, well, what resources do you have in your external world? What is your financial integrity like? Sorry, I'm kind of veering off from the question, but I'll
Well,
bring it back.
yeah.
How is your financial integrity? What kind of support systems do you have? Do you have a therapist? Do you have a support group? Do you have like a spiritual organization that you're part of? Do you have close friendships that, where you can actually really speak to your experience and not have to perform for their acceptance?
Mm,
Do you have a connection to nature? Are you part of a workplace where your contributions are valued and respected? There's a lot of different factors to look at. So
yeah.
we'll look at all that, kind of identify the areas that are stronger and also the areas that need a little work, and then kind of help them fill in those gaps. So move towards becoming extremely nervous system literate, understanding where their nervous systems are, because at the heart of the embodied aspect of trauma is a traumatized nervous system, a nervous system that is stuck in fight or flight or
Yeah.
freeze and shut down, and helping them to um, yeah, create more of a gentle ebb and flow between those states, rather than, getting kind of cascading between these extremes.
Yeah, anxiety or trauma
Hmm.
or trauma response that might not be healthy. Like we see that all the time. Like I for anybody that has no idea what anxiety is, I try and explain it as it's literally a physiological response to
Hmm.
it's not just something I'm nervous about. Like it is a physiological response where I am shaking, I am wringing my hands, I am experiencing heart palpitations. Like I could specifically list physiological response in the hopes that maybe they can understand kind of sort of what having anxiety, for example, would feel like.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Sometimes I forget to bring that up because I'm so surrounded by people for whom it's obvious all the time. I just forget to, like, yeah, of course. So
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I just
sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
yeah.
Yeah, so in the same way that anxiety is a physiological, set of patterns and responses within our bodies rather than an emotion, which I think a lot of people confuse it for. They think it's an
Yeah.
emotion.
Yeah.
Nervousness is an emotion. It can also be a state. The same is true of trauma. There's this misunderstanding that trauma is the thing that happened to you, and that's not true. 70, an estimated 70 or so percent of North Americans have experienced something traumatic, but only like 5 to 10% of those people end up traumatized. So I think that's what's missing from the kind of discourse, especially in kind of pop psychology Instagram spaces today. Everyone thinks that
Yeah.
because they've experienced trauma that they're traumatized, and that's just not the
What it
case.
what is the difference? Can you clarify that? I'd like to learn.
So the traumatic event is the thing that happened to you. That's you know the event. The trauma, the traumatized response within the body is the incomplete stress response when an event is so overwhelming and so overpowering and yeah, so overwhelms our capacity to cope. um,
Mhm.
it is not psychologically or biologically safe for our body to process all of that at once, particularly when so many of us are met after the trauma with people who are just like, yeah, that sucked, but what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and like, look on the bright side. And it's just very denying, and it never allows us to actually digest the experience. It's like stuffing your mouth with too many things and you can't swallow it
Yeah.
all at once, and you're just slowly, your body's trying to chew it. And meanwhile, people are just stuffing more shit in your mouth. Like that's kind
And
of
you're like,
that's kind
stop.
of what it's like.
Yeah.
That's what it's like. It's like the embodied version of that, but with like the most horrible things that you can imagine. Um,
Okay.
so that anxiety is your body desperately trying to, like, make sense of and discharge and process all of that,
Yeah.
stress that has been placed on your system. And some ways it does that, is in the form of, like, a lot of people with trauma, kind of shake a lot, um, or there will be chronic pain. Like if your brain for long enough uh, senses this psychological threat, posed due to this overwhelm, it doesn't know what to do with that charge. So it's just like, okay, well, it doesn't make sense that this threat is still present. So I must have made a mistake. It must be pain. So it just sticks it in your body, and it's just
Wow.
like, okay. So a
That
lot of survivors have, compromised immune systems, and also this pain that can't be explained by any doctor or therapist or physio that they go to, because it's just like it's uh, kind of brain miscalculation or reattribution. So yeah, the study of pain is huge right now, and it's making a lot of strides. But uh,
that makes
yeah.
so much sense. That makes
Hmm.
so much sense. As soon I'm like, oh my God, so many light bulbs just went off. As soon as you clarified it as your brain is literally trying to rewire how to respond to what is a perceived threat, which like
Hmm.
naturally we're inclined to point potential threats out.
Hmm.
You see a snake on the ground, you get terrified, or you have a response to that kind of thing. Well, of course that would happen to anything that might be triggering. That
Hmm.
would happen in response to anything that might be triggering for you. And I'm like, well, then no wonder there was an episode of anxiety. No wonder prolonged exposure to that turned into depression when I felt like it was hopeless. No wonder that turned into suicidal ideation even further down the line. It was like,
Yeah.
oh, that
Yeah.
was so helpful.
It can really shed a lot of can open us to a lot of compassion to realize that this is what's going on underneath it. Like I know for myself, I struggled with severe depression, like from childhood all the way into about my mid-20s.
Mm.
And for the longest time, I thought that was just like, it was evidence that I was broken. It was evidence that like I must have done something bad to deserve a life that was so horrible. At one point, I was even like, maybe I'm deluding myself and this isn't depression and this is just how everyone else experiences the world, but they're just managing it much better than me. And it was
Mm.
only once I got into a safe container where, and this often happens, you know, you could be traumatized and it might be years before the symptoms show up because the context of your life is still really unsafe. And so it's like, if you're still in the fire, you can't sit down and cry, you know.
Yeah.
It was only once I kind of got to that place where things had calmed down, where things got a lot more quiet because I had my injury and I just couldn't do anything else or distract myself, that, you know, all this stuff came up. And in that moment, I was able to appreciate, oh my God, that depression was like a wet blanket on top of a fire that I had no resources or tools to cope with at that time. It was a protective
Yeah.
strategy. And thank God that I had that depression, you know, which is not something that I think a lot of people are
But it
inclined to
makes
think when
sense.
they're, you know, in a depressive episode. But it, you know, it's like a fire retardant, you know?
Right, right. When I had suicidal ideation, there was an ER nurse who said, "Honey, it's okay because we look at ideation, even though you're not
Mm,
completing, you're looking at ideation as a sprained ankle," in her words. And
mhm,
that analogy made a lot of sense to me too. I was like, "Oh, okay, it's still a problem. It's still something to pay attention to. It might not be a broken ankle, but it's sprained. It's on the way there, and it's worth paying attention to, and it's worth bringing some awareness to," I guess is what she was trying to tell me, because I felt bad that people were fussing over me that day because
mhm,
I'm weird like that. So when somebody is going through any type of crisis like suicidal ideation, some sort of mental crisis, our loved ones absolutely want to help us through that, but have a hard time maybe directing them as to how they can help. What would your
mhm.
advice be to that loved one in those moments? What are some of the things that they can do to help, or are there any resources maybe they can go to that you might know about?
Yeah. Okay. So I have so many thoughts about this, and I'm so excited to share so many of them. And I'm going to try and keep my like what I say in a straight line. But if I start to go off in too many different
That's
directions, like
okay.
I give you permission to just rein me
Yeah.
back in. Um, so the first thing is that, you know, obviously we love the people that we're with, and we want them to be better. And sometimes what that makes us do is try and drag them into the light with us rather than sitting with them in the dark and holding their hand.
Okay.
And that is
Got
often
it.
what a lot of people in a state of mental illness need, because they're already struggling with the shame of thinking they're broken. And our attempts to, and our bids to try and fix or change what they're going through, rather than inserting ourselves into their experience and, you know, being with them in what they're experiencing, can be interpreted by their systems, by the person who's struggling with whatever they're going through, as this is evidence that I'm not okay. Everyone around
Mm,
me is reconfirming that I'm not okay and that this is stressing them out, and I am a burden because look how much stress and distress I'm causing to other people. So what I often suggest to people who are in this situation is, this is really a put your oxygen mask on first moment. You know, if, and it can really shed light on how much of our own discomfort do we have the tools and the presence to really sit with. Because if someone else is going through a lot of discomfort and we don't have the tools to sit in our own discomfort, we're not going to be able to meet them there in theirs.
yeah.
So it can be a beautiful opportunity, um, for partners to go through their own growth process and their own transformation process. I often recommend, you know, rather than like fussing and fiddling and forcing this other person to go to therapy, it's like, listen, you get you into therapy, get yourself into therapy, you know,
Yeah.
get curious about whatever might be coming up in your system that's being triggered by this experience of feeling helpless with someone that you're close to around you. You know, the fact that we live in a society where, you know, the nuclear family model still reigns supreme, that's very insular. You know, we expect our partners to meet all these needs for us. When our partner can't meet those needs, it can be really scary. So the
Yeah.
invitation is to re-enter into more of a communal consciousness, a community, you know, to really expand our own support structures and our own community, and um, get curious about what helps us feel alive and centered again, whether that's, you know, putting more effort into a hobby so that not only are we really supporting ourselves where we're at, we're also providing an experience for the person that we're with of like, hey, it's okay for you to be where you are. I'm
Hmm.
okay where I am. I'm here when, I'm here to be a support when you need it. And, it's okay for you to take your time. You're like,
Okay.
it's okay for you to take your time. A huge, factor that isn't talked about often is we mirror each other's nervous system states. So if someone is dealing with mental illness and their nervous system's all fucked up, just chaos,
Right.
and the person in their life who's supposed to be a support is freaking the fuck out because they don't know how to deal with this thing, that's just
Yep.
feeding into the cycle of dysfunction. So in as much as possible, inviting partners or friends or family members of people who are struggling to really use this as an opportunity to dive deeper into their own, um, you know,
Hmm.
self-regulation toolkit, to get curious about that person's context, um,
Yeah.
and enter into that space with them rather than trying to drag them somewhere else, because
Yeah.
their system is trying to find homeostasis in whatever ways that it can, and
Well,
you
you are.
trying to interrupting that process, might be picking that scab, to use that analogy again.
Mm. Okay, got it. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
time for it's just a time for connection. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when it's super needed. And we forget that because, we get lost in our daily lives and things come up and schedules are out there, but that's the time to bond together without expectation
Mm-hmm.
more than any other time. That's when to
Mm-hmm.
focus on that. That makes a lot
Mm-hmm.
of sense.
Yeah, because sometimes there's this it's never intentional, but there can be this covert contract that we create with the people that we love who are struggling, where it's like,
Yeah.
I can't be okay unless you're okay.
There's this unspoken expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, and you don't even know, and then you're held responsible somehow later. And it's like, ooh, now we really have a problem.
Yeah. So it's to kind of look at where we're doing that with other people, um,
Hmm.
whether or not, we're struggling. We create covert contracts with people all the time
Yeah.
where there's this unspoken expectation, and kind of being like, okay, how can I learn how to be okay, even if they're not okay?
Mm, got it.
How can I
And
take responsibility for my own okayness so that I can show up with a full cup for them?
right, because they might need it.
Mm-hmm.
We all need it from
Mm-hmm.
time to time, and you never know. Like working on yourself is working, for you and everybody else. That's how I've always viewed it,
Mm-hmm.
like 1,000%. My last question for you is just: we've heard about the wonderful coaching, we've heard about the wonderful philosophies, you kind of follow. What's next for you? What can we look forward to?
Um, I That's a good question. I am very slowly plugging away at my university work because I also run my coaching practice full time. So,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
probably going to be quite a few years before I get my therapy license, my license to practice as a trauma therapist. In the meantime, you can find me doing one-to-one work, um, in my own coaching practice. I am aware that because of our current economic, situation, like affording therapy or coaching, they shouldn't be luxuries, but at this point they really are. So I'm really going to
Yeah.
be focusing. I'm going to be coming up on the um, second year of my business, or rather, I've completed my second year. I'm heading into my third year. This is really going to be about building out opportunities for people to access my work and access these tools, in a way that it doesn't cost as much as doing it one-to-one. So I'm going to be adding
Mm-hmm.
some workshops for sale on my site. That's a big goal of mine, and having them for sale at sliding scale pricing. Um, Another big goal is going to be to create a membership container where people can, they can either access my courses individually, or they can purchase a membership and have access to all of them, and also have access to, like, group coaching calls once per week, sort of thing, so that there's still a way to get that one-on-one support. Because I know for myself, when I was really struggling financially, because trauma really impacts your ability to make money.
We could
And
do a whole episode on just that.
yeah, yeah. Or trauma, mental illness, like any of these things really impacts your ability to make money sometimes.
Yeah.
So, when I was in that position and I really needed help, and I was approaching all these facilitators being like, I really need like one-on-one support. And they were like, sorry, buy my online course. Like, I want to find ways to, have the online courses, but still have opportunities for someone to get like an actual person, um, because, at a certain point, I did all the online courses and I read all the books, and I was like, no, I still need someone to sit in a room with me and be with me.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's my biggest goal for
Cool.
next year.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to that as well. Thank you so much for all the insight, all the light bulbs and gems throughout this episode. Really, they appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.